Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to this lecture series on ESG analytics and green finance. Today we'll be talking about the strategizing, the investing, the investable sustainable finance and all that aspects with respect to the sustainability of the finance. My name is Atul Tripathi and I am an honorary adjunct fellow at National Maritime Foundation. First thing first, what's the taxonomy? The taxonomy is around this entire green bond, sustainability linked bonds. It's a very important aspect because you have to classify and first and that is going to be issued second, and then you're going to set a clear boundaries of the bounds of the taxonomy to make all the relevant disclosures that are comparable, eligibility screenable, and greenwashing harder. That means here why the word greenwashing is important is the fact that this is one of the big risks, as we have been stressing over and over again, and has been causing a lot of delays and increase in the cost of investments at any given time period. Now, this climate bonds taxonomy, if you look at it, it comes in the various forms of energy to transport to industry to land use, buildings, and ICT for waste. Very important aspect is what has been certified, certification criteria have been approved, some of which are under development and some of which are due to be commencing. So if you look at this energy side, the storage and the nuclear, they both are due to commence. Similarly, for the cement industry, it's a cement production to glass production to steel, chemical, fuel production. All of them have got to come to the due commencement. However, there are some that are under the due development, the criteria development have been taking place. Let's take the case of transmission and distribution and case of energy. A lot of interesting things are happening in the climate bond taxonomy, which is a very important aspect because you see what actually a taxonomy does. It is going to provide you a standardized classification of instruments and eligible activities so that the investors can identify, compare, and aggregate sustainable bonds across markets with consistent expectations. So three important things are taking place because of the taxonomy. One is identification, two is comparability, and three is aggregation. Because from the investor's perspective, that's a very important factor because it is going to connect the investor issuer frameworks to recognized categories based on data feeds, which is going to enable the vendor ingestion and index screening with lower diligence friction. That is another important factor. Because you see, the entire game is going to be played around the greenwashing making the greenwashing harder, which is just mentioned about it. So the core instrument families are around green bonds, GBP as they call them. So the second is around social bonds, SBP. The third is your sustainability bond, SBG. And the fourth is sustainability linked bond, SLBP. So the green bonds, they are use of proceed instruments which are financing eligible environmental projects under the four different components. One is use of proceeds, two, project evaluation and selection, three, management of proceeds, and fourth is reporting. The social bonds that are there, they're flowing around the use of proceed instruments where they're targeting social outcomes, say affordable housing, access to essential services under the same four components of the architecture that have been adopted to social different categories. However, in case of a sustainability bond or SBG, the use of proceeds instruments, they're combining green and social categories within a single framework, and the reporting is set to be aligned with the ICMA guideline. A very important factor again on this thing, something we have discussed in the previous lecture around this ICMA guidelines and the principles. We'll also talk about it in a few minutes down the line around this ICMA guidelines, the principles, the alignment with the SDG goals and other factors around. Then finally about the sustainability linked bond, SLBs. So these are general corporate purpose instruments whose terms vary with issuer level KPIs against sustainability performance targets, which have been governed by 5 pillars. So the 5 pillars again are KPI selection, SPT calibration, bond characteristics, reporting, and most importantly, verification. That is the second party verification that we've been talking about. We'll again talk about it in the few more minutes down the line, more in detail around this thing. So the eligible criteria and examples of the use of proceeds, they basically revolve around two things. One is green categories and social categories. So typical green categories include your renewable energy, energy efficiency, clean transportation, sustainable water, pollution prevention, circular economy, biodiversity, to name a few of them. And social categories, they typically include affordable basic infrastructure, access to essential services, your employment generation, affordable housing, socio-economic advancements, again to name a few of them around the social categories regarding this use of proceeds as an example. So how actually is this taxonomy going to map with the disclosures? Another very interesting and important concept that needs to be understood. So there are two ways it will happen. So first, the issuer framework should map each project or KPI to ICMA categories or SLB pillars, which have been defined with the defined thresholds and exclusions, and disclose the capex versus refinancing and look back periods for refinancing of the assets. That's the first way. And the second way is that harmonized reporting templates with units, baselines, scopes, calculation methodologies, turning the category mapping into reproducible, machine-readable data sets. So that's another way of doing this thing, the taxonomy mapping with the ICMA disclosure and the guidelines that are around it. Interoperability and regional taxonomies are another important factor because the ICMA categories, they have been designed to complement regional taxonomies and the regulatory frameworks, allowing the issuers to present crosswalks that are going to improve cross-border comparability and index eligibility, because clear mapping of the notes will help the investors reconcile ICMA categories with local rules while preserving the single global classification language for the markets. So why the taxonomies actually clarify the matters to investors is a very important thing. The clarity for the investor's perspective from the taxonomy angle is very interesting and important point for any investor, because two reasons. One, it reduces greenwashing risk, and two, it speeds up the portfolio aggregation. So by greenwashing risk, we are basically anchoring eligibility and reporting it to the recognized categories and component requirements, while speeding up the green portfolio aggregation is about index screening and surveillance by aligning public disclosures to harmonized fields and category tags. That brings me to another interesting and important point, and this is around the use of proceeds, which is where you're financing the eligible projects, but most importantly with discipline. So ring fencing the money and defining what counts and report like clockwork, that is how the proceeds, or UOP bonds, they're going to turn the intent into investable projects. So you have a green bond, and then you see the green bond entire approach that is going to be taken. So the use of proceed, actually what it means, the proceeds are exclusively allocated to predefined eligible social green or social categories with the explicit thresholds and exclusions, while they are linking your capital directly to projects, investors that can evaluate and the important point, and the second point is around the issuers disclosing financing versus the refinancing of the shares and looking back windows for refined or refinance assets to evidence additionality and asset eligibility over the time period. And we talked about the project disciplining about it. So project evaluation and selection is another important factor that comes around the project disciplining, because the frameworks must outline the decision processes, they must spell out the eligibility criteria, the environment and social objectives, what are the risk controls with the governance rules for the oversight and the periodic review. That is the one that is going to bring out the project discipline with respect to use of proceeds, and a clear selection of governance, documentation, due diligence to improve comparability across issuers and support to the auditors and index reviewers. That is going to form the base framework for this entire project disciplining. The management of proceeds, or what we call as ring fencing, the net proceeds, they're going to be tracked via sub accounts or portfolio approaches with disclosure for the temporary placement of unallocated funds and timelines to full allocation. The internal controls, wherever applicable, external checks on allocation of the strength and auditability and investor confidence is the second important point in it. The reporting cadence, just talking about the allocation and the impact, it has to be understood again from the investor's perspective, because at least the annual allocation reporting is expected, until full-time allocation, that is including the amounts, percentages by category, capex versus refinancing splits, and unallocated balances have been taken place, where feasible issuers must provide annual impact metrics using harmonized indicators such as, like take the case of megawatt hours generated, trillion of carbon dioxide avoided, how much was the water saved, with the baselines, factors, scopes, methods for reproducibility. Why does it actually matter for the investors and the indices? Because the principal aligned user proceed structures, or UOP, they're created standardized. They're machine readable data fields that vendors and index providers can ingest while lowering your transaction cost and greenwashing risk, avoiding your completely greenwashing risks. And the public evidence is going to be packing up with the framework, the second party opinion, what is the offering of the extracts and the annual reports with verification, the acceleration of the classification and support durable demand. So when you look at it from the very practical checklist that needs to be taken care of, has got two important aspects. One is the publication of GBP aligned framework with categories, thresholds, exclusions, selection governance, proceeds of tracking, the reporting of the commitments, then obtaining an SPO and reflecting the core items in the offering of the documents. And second is use of ICMA templates for allocation and impact reports, disclosure of the methods, baselines, synchronization of the verification with reporting, where you're going to support your index exclusion or inclusion as well. So a pretty interesting framework why you need to even understand the use of proceeds and why is it bringing with the project disciplining with the money that is involved, and the importance from the perspective of an investor. That brings us to another interesting point, and that is around sustainability linked instruments, where you're going to move the KPIs with the movement of the coupons, because you put your money where your matrices are and tie the coupons with lower level KPIs so as to step up or step down and track the performance every time. So your ESG communication and sustainable finance is going to be around your green bond to social bonds, so sustainability bonds, sustainability linked bonds, green loans, and your sustainability linked loans, and they are all going to combine up with their sustainability linked SLI or sustainability linked instruments. This is what we call as, because that is where your movement, the coupons are going to be tracked. Let's try and understand the mechanics and how it works and what is the importance around this thing. So if we look at the mechanics, the issuer is going to select a small set of material that is with the auditable KPI in terms of absolute or intensity based emissions, and commits to time bound SPTs, your coupon step up or step downs, applying at the observation date based on performance versus targets. Because the proceeds are general purpose, the credibility is going to rest on KPI materiality, SPT ambitions with clear triggered logic, and independent verification rather than project ring fencing. Selecting KPIs that matter, again, not a large set of KPIs, but a very small set of KPIs, generally 2 or 3 of them. They're going to be tied up to core value drivers and the sector materiality, that is emissions intensity for heavy industry, renewable share of utilities, with consistent scopes, baselines, and methods for benchmarking. Again, the second point in this regard is around the document relevance, the data quality, the pathway alignment, so that the investors can compare the ambition of peers versus the ones that have been recognized with the sector trajectories. The calibrating of the SPTs beyond business as usual talks about setting time-bound targets aligned with credible pathways, disclosing your baselines, boundaries, methodologies, and interim waypoints to demonstrate ambition and enable your reproducibility, while including your change management rules for methodology updates, and M&A to preserve target integrity throughout the bond's life cycle. The pricing, meanwhile, is going to be very meaningful, is going to have a very meaningful economics, because the size of step ups and downs to be material relative to expected spreads, avoid de-minimization incentives by modeling sensitivity under multiple performance scenarios and credit conditions, and the use of multiple, which was earlier called as observation dates, to keep the incentives live and reduce cliff edge or all or nothing dynamics that weaken accountability. The term sheet triggers and the legal clarity, again, has got an important point and has got two points that needs to be covered effectively, is defining KPI formulas and clarifying your cumulative versus binary treatment. So when you look at the KPI formulas definitions, you're looking at SPT trajectories, observation calendars, trigger logic, step magnitudes, fallback provisions for data restatements, or boundary changes that have been directly offering in documents, while your clarity or clarification around cumulative versus binary treatment in multiple KPI structures are there, so that the investors can assess the probability of the weighted economics. And why does this actually matter to the investors? This kind of a design is because you're tying the coupons to the issuer level KPIs. We're shifting the focus from asset eligibility to enterprise transformation, enabling your portfolio level engagement and clearer accountability. And secondly, you've got a strong evidence or verification and economically meaningful term variation, which is going to mitigate your greenwashing risks and support comparability across the issuers and the sectors. That is an important point when we look at it from the SLIs or sustainability linked instruments. However, another important point that needs to be considered is tying up of the ICMA principles with SDG mapping. So sustainability goals are very important points, because here you're aligning your ICMA to market trust, then map to SDG for the purpose clarity. If you look at it from the product standards to your thematic and additional guidance to the reporting of the guidance, so the entire structure has been put up with the SDG goals in mind. The ICMA principles have been aligned with your SDG goals. This is what the framework talks about. Why this? What actually ICMA covers versus what SDG impact adds? When you look at it, it's got two factors. One is ICMA defines how structure, user proceeds, and sustainability linked bonds, eligible criteria, categories, or issuer level KPIs, proceeds, governance, and reporting verification, so that the instruments are comparable and credible to capital markets. And the second point is around the SDG impact standards. They are embedded into enterprise level decision quality, objectives, risk and impact, what are the processes, measurement methods, and broad oversight, so that the bond frameworks are going to reflect the real strategy and controls, not just the labels. The mapping of the basics of ICMA categories and KPIs to SDG targets will start with ICMA, where you're going to tag each user proceeds projects to ICMA categories, or each SLB KPI to be defined metric, and then map them to a small set of relevant SDG targets to clarify your intended outcomes and avoid SDG greenwashing. And you're going to document the mapping of the rationale and the boundaries, which is going to include your scope, geography, organizational units in method notes, so that the external parties can interpret and replicate your KPI impact, and calculations that are going to be there. Because there is a lot of data discipline that is going to map this decision very, very useful, because the use of ICMA's harmonized indicators, such as megawatts, are generated with the baseline factors, calculation of the methodologies for reproducibility and year-on-year comparability. And around the same points is around the maintaining of the public evidence packs in terms of framework, SPO, offering of the extracts, what are the annual reports, what are the verification statements, how is consistent has that been with the identifiers for efficient ingestion by the data vendors and index providers. The governance and the assurance too is there very important to anchor the credibility, because it is here that you're going to apply your SDG impacts governance and management requirement. to set the board level oversight, decision gates, data quality controls. You're going to link it with the SDG targets to capital allocation and use the SDG impact assurance scheme to plus the along with the ICMA encouraged SPO verification to provide your independent checks as in for investors so that they can evaluate consistently. Another point that we need to look at is SDG mapping with your assurance, where you're talking about, turning the labels of data into a trust factor, because the SDG targets, the use of proceeds to SDG targets, they have to prove with opinions, verification, impact reporting. And the second party opinion is very important. So the second party opinion by a trusted, respected evaluation firm will provide a clearer assessment of the issuer's green bond framework or sustainability bond framework. And the second party opinions will strengthen the credibility of the bond, and it will help to gain the confidence of the investors by looking into the investment in a green bond. Why does this actually matter? Because the investor's perspective as well as from the bond issuer's perspective. Now this is very, very important. This is coming from Sustainalytics, a very important firm which is working in the field of green bonds and sustainability linked instruments, and has got a lot of credibility. So alignment with the SDG mapping will start with ICMA's use of proceed categories and map each eligible project to a small number of relevant SDG targets to clarify intended outcomes and avoid SDG mappings, and the documenting of the mapping rationale with the boundaries, which is going to come in terms of the scope and geography, and the methods in public notes so that the external parties can interpret and replicate the calculations consistently. It is here that the role of the second party opinions is going to be very important because of two reasons. One, obtaining a second party opinion or SPO at a framework stage to assess the alignment with GBP, SBP, SG, SLBP is going to with clarity for eligibility criteria, proceeds governance, reporting of the commitments. We will publish with the investor for due diligence. And secondly, use of SPO feedback, that is your second party opinion feedback, to tighten thresholds and exclusions and the impact methodologies before the launch to prove the credibility and index readiness. So these are the two reasons why the role of SPOs or second party opinions become very important, because the external verification is there to mitigate your greenwashing, because you're trying to commit to post issuance verification of allocation of use of proceed bonds, and where feasible, impact matrices or KPI outcomes have had observation dates for SLBs so that the verifier scope and standards have been disclosed, and alignment with the verification cadence and reporting cycles so that the investors and the index providers can update the eligibility and monitor performance promptly. This is where again the impact of the reporting, that is decision making, becomes very useful, because here you are providing at least an annual allocation report until the full allocation of the impact reporting and feasibility has been harmonized, and you're maintaining a public evidence pack where you're having the framework and the SPO and the offering extracts with the annual reports and verification statements for machine readable vendor ingestion and faster index screening. How actually does this SDG impact the standards, the strengthen and the bond credibility? Is because you are able to apply the SDG impact to set enterprise level SDG objectives, embed risk impact processes, establish board oversightedness so that the bond frameworks reflect real decision quality, not just the labels, and you're using the SDG impact assurance scheme to validate both the processes and the reported outcomes so as to complement the ICMA encouraged SPOs or second party opinions and verification for a comprehensive assurance. That is the main reason why this is becoming an important point, this SPO, role of SPOs in this or the second party opinions in case of any green bonds. The green bonds also brings us to another important point. What is the eligibility and the categories and the concretization of certain examples, because you're defining what counts up for front. You have the maturity of the issuers, green bond frameworks and internal processes, the complexity of the portfolio for green projects and assessment including eligibility assessments according to the threshold criteria, and the hourly rate of the external reviewers which will be taking place as per the undertasking of the work. I know these are the important points that need to be considered for the green bond eligibility, because Take the case of renewable energy. The eligible activities would include something like solar PV, your wind, your geothermal, small hydro, meeting environmental safeguards and associated grid connections that will enable your renewable integration. So take the case of financing about 200 megawatts of solar farms and related transmission upgrades with your annual reporting of megawatt hours generated and trillion carbon dioxide avoided using disclosed emission factors. Take another example. Second example in this regard is with respect to energy efficiencies, where the projects that reduce energy use or losses, such as individual industrial process upgrades, building retrofits to high performance standards, smart grids, and efficient district energies. For example, retrofitting commercial buildings with to be achieved specified intensity thresholds with the impact KPIs on kilowatt hours saved per square meter and resultant emissions and reductions. Then you have clean transportation as another example, the low carbon transport models and infrastructure, including electric rails, metros, electric buses, EV charging networks, and active mobility corridors meeting eligibility criteria. Here you can use the funding of the metro line extension and e-bus depots with annual KPIs on passenger kilometers shifted and avoided emissions based on transparent methodologies. Sustainable water and wastewater management is another example where you're looking at water supply efficiencies and wastewater treatment, reuse, desalination with energy performance safeguards, the nature-based solutions for watershed resilience. Here you're going to measure it with the upgrading of a wastewater plant to a higher treatment standard with KPIs on how many how many cubic meters have been treated, pollutant load that has been removed, the energy intensity per cubic meter. Pollution prevention and control around the circular economy would include your waste reduction, recycling facilities, methane capture, industrial emissions control, product process redesigning for circularity, subject to clear thresholds and exclusions. For example, here you can measure them using the financing of materials recovery facilities with KPIs on tons that have been diverted from landfill and life cycle emissions, the benefits with stated system boundaries. The climate change adaptation, when you look at it as an example, it will be around infrastructure and measures that increase the resilience to physical climate risks such as flood defenses, urban cooling, wildfire mitigation, resilient water systems. So an example measurement can be around coastal flood barrier upgrades with KPIs on protected population assets and quantified risk reduction and methodologies that is going to disclose them within method notes. Similarly, when you look at the biodiversity and ecosystem services, the measurements of conservation, restoration, sustainable management, and terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems that are delivering your measurable biodiversity outcomes and co-benefits. So, for example, here you can measure in terms of mangrove restoration for coastal protection with KPIs on hectares restored, biodiversity indices, what are the modeled avoided damages with calculation methods and published. So, implementation of the essentials across categories would include your disclosing finances versus refinancing shares and look back periods, defining the thresholds and exclusions, aligning with the governance for project selection, risk management in the public framework. These are some of the ways in which the green bond eligibility factors are going to be looked at, with respect to various categories and some of the examples that we have talked about of, a very important factor. That also brings us to another important point is around green bond itself. What counts and how you're going to disclose it? Because unless you directly define the categories, you disclose the scope, capex, refinancing, it's not going to work out, because the typical eligible categories where to be included in the frameworks are your renewable energy, energy efficiency, clean transport, green buildings, water waste, climate adaptation. So let's look at each one of them at a time. How will you include in what are the frameworks that you need to take care of? So take the case of renewable energy. You're talking about solar, wind, geothermal, eligible hydro. What is the enabling grid interconnections with the impact of the KPIs such as megawatt hour generated, trillions of carbon dioxide avoided using disclosure factors. Energy efficiency would include your industrial process upgrades, building your retrofits to high performance standards, smart grids, district energy with quantified kilowatt hour savings and emissions. Clean transportation would include your electric rail, metro, electric buses, electric EV charging points. What is the active mobility infrastructure with the avoided emissions which have been calculated from transparent modal shift methods. Green buildings would include your new buildings retrofitting with the meeting with the specified certifications or the intensity to thresholds with consistent baselines, scopes, and geographic boundaries. Water and waste water would include your efficiencies, reuse, advancement of the treatment, resilience of the supply, nature-based watershed solutions, KPIs on how many cubic meter was treated, saved, and energy intensity per cubic meter. Climate adaptation would include your flood defenses, urban cooling, wildlife fire mitigation, resilient water systems, coastal protection with risk reduction metrics and your method notes that are around it. The second point in the similar regard is going to be around capex versus refinancing, the considerations that the issuers should disclose. Here you have got to take three important points into consideration. First is around quantify the share of proceeds for new capex versus refinancing of the existing eligible assets and explain how refinancing is going to support an ongoing green asset base. Second is around the state look back periods for refinanced assets and confirmed continued eligibility against the stated criteria and the objectives to maintain your integrity. And third is aligning the offering documents with framework commitments on use of proceeds, selection, governance, proceeds tracking, allocation, impact, reporting cadence. The reporting cadence and impact methods that is going to pass through the due diligence that pass the diligence include your providing at least annual allocations, where feasible, publish annual impact KPIs using ICMAs, harmonized indicators with baselines, emissions, factors, scopes, calculation approaches so that the analyst can reproduce the results, and maintain a public evidence pack in terms of frameworks, second party opinion, offering of the extracts, allocation, impact reports, verification of the statement. So why does this actually matters for the investors on the indices? Because the ICMA aligned plus harmonized machine readable data is going to again lower your diligence because of friction, because it's going to reduce your greenwashing, and there are clear categories, transparent capex and refinancing of the disclosures and consistent methods is going to create a comparability backbone for cross-issuer analysis. In the similar lines, the sustainability linked and SDG linked bonds, and the design and the driver's performance, that is very important because you're going to pick a few KPIs that are truly valued and they're going to set the SPTs beyond business as usual. And here you see a diagram around the sustainability linked bond with the social bond and the green bond, and each of them has got its own, the various bonds that are there or the instruments that are there, along with the sweet spot of combining all three of them, which is going to come for sustainability bonds, because the selecting of the material KPIs is very important for the auditable purposes, because the decision useful KPIs are tied to core value drivers and sector materiality in terms, for example, absolute or intensity emissions, a renewable share, water intensity, network use, with consistent scopes and baselines for benchmarking, explaining the KPI relevance, data quality, and pathway alignment so that the investors can compare ambition versus peers and credible sector trajectories. You're going to setting up the ambitious SPTs because then you're going to calibrate time-bound SPTs beyond business as usual and align with credible pathways, disclose your baselines, boundaries, methods, and interim waypoints to support reproducibility and year-on-year monitoring. You're going to include your change management rules for methodology updates and mergers and acquisition to preserve your target integrity across the bond life. The coupon step mechanics and observation dates would include your size step-ups, downs to be material relative to expected spreads, avoid de-minimals, incentives by modeling multiple performance and credit scenarios, set up multiple early observation dates, with clear trigger logic, align the reporting and independent verification calendars to the observation schedule, because the fallback and redemption, if the targets are missed, are very serious, because the document fallback provisions in legal terms for data restatement, boundary methods, changes, or corporate actions will clarify cumulative versus binary treatment in multiple KPI structures. And you're going to specify your remediation options like your enhancement of the step size, escalation of verification scopes, additional disclosures so as to maintain accountability if STPs are not met. When you look at it from the sector-specific examples, what material actually looks like. So take the case of utilities, KPIs such as scope 1 or 2 emissions intensity, the renewable generation share, SPTs which have been aligned to decarbonize the pathways, step-ups linked to interim and final observation dates to reflect transition progress. So some of the examples around what material actually looks like in case of utilities. In case of cement, it can be your KPIs around clinker ratio, your process emissions intensity, thermal substitution rate, SPTs that have been allowed to sector roadmaps, legal terms that have been defining your methodology for boundary changes and the project startups. The telecommunications, as an example for the materials, would look like your network intensity and renewable energy share as KPIs. SPTs with the staged observation dates, triggers that account for M&A, network upgrade with predefined treatment. And then the documentation, reporting and verification is an important factor around the sustainability linked and SDG linked bonds, because in offering documents, you are defining your KPI formulas, your SPT trajectories, the observation calendars, trigger logics, step method magnitudes, fallback clauses to make the economies transparent and enforceable. You're committing to at least an annual KPI reporting with methods, baselines, scopes, boundaries, and obtaining independent external verification of KPI outcomes at or near observation dates with the published verifiable scope standards. Then it becomes an important point of the market structure and the issuance of the strategy, because from here you're going to take the mandate, you're going to be building up your portfolio around it. So if you observe out here the various divergence growth in terms of sustainability bonds that have been happening up in terms of the amount, how the economies have been performing around the sustainability bonds outstanding. This is the bond structures is going to be a very important point, because the market structure is where the participants are acting, and there's a complete pipeline that has been developed, because the supply side will include your sovereigns, supranatural agencies, corporates, financials, and municipals, including which are issuing under ICMA aligned frameworks. Demand is being led by the asset managers, insurers, pension funds, banks, ESG thematic mandates with index tracking overlays, and the data pipes are going to run through the SPO providers, that is your second party opinion providers, verifiers, data vendors, your index teams that are going to rely on ICMA aligned disclosures and the harmonized templates for rapid classification and monitoring. The instrument choice, whether you're going to be using UOP or use of proceeds or SLB, sustainability linked bonds, depends on few factors such as use of proceeds with suits issuers where there's a clear eligible project pipelines which have been ring fenced proceeds under the 4 GBP components, and the SLB or sustainability linked bond is going to suit enterprise level transition signaling where KPIs and SPTs can be verified on observation dates, and the decision is going to hinge on asset pipeline, maturity, KPI measurability, investor base preference, index eligibility pathways. All of them has to be supported with the ICMS guidance, by the way. The pre-issuance readiness and the is very important, because it's here the frameworks and the opinions are going to matter, because when you are going to publish an ICMI aligned framework with the categories such as thresholds such as UOP or KPIs, SPTs with your sustainability linked bonds, the proceeds, KPI governance, reporting cadence and verification commitments is going to earn obtaining a second party opinion to de-risk the investor diligence is the important point as far as pre-issuance readiness is concerned. Because here, aligning the offering documents to the framework in terms of UOP, that is use of proceed terms, the selection governance, the proceeds tracking and lookbacks, for your SLBs triggering mechanism with the observation calendars and verification covenants as an important thing. Similarly, the data discipline for price is going to be another important factor, because use of harmonized ICMA templates or functional allocation impact with the UOP or KPI SPT data sets such as SLBs, sustainability linked bonds, including units, baselines, factors, scopes, boundaries, so that the analysts can reproduce results without the follow-ups and maintain a public evidence pack framework. SPO, second party opinions, offering extracts, annual reports, verifier statements to accelerate vendor ingestion and index screening. The execution strategy would include your timing, syndication, and investor mix. The time launches when comparable prints is going to signal the demand, and the spread stability and pre-sound key accounts with evidence pack to tighten IPTs and build high quality books. And coordinate with book runners to target ESG thematic mandates. Alongside core credit buyers, you leveraging ICMA aligned disclosures that will fit into their screening models. The pricing mechanics and book building, when you look at it for the UOP, clarity on capex versus refinancing and look backs plus credible impact KPIs can support stronger price tensions and new issue premia discipline, giving lower diligence friction. For SLBs, a step size materiality, early observation dates, enforceable verification clauses, improvement in terms of investor uptake, aligning economics and performance accountability are important, because post-issuance performance reporting and indexing readiness is going to be the next thing to look at. Post-issuance performance is going to be around the reporting and the index readiness, where you're going to deliver at least annual allocation proceeds with the UOP use of proceeds or KPI updates with SLBs, your sustainability linked bonds using harmonized templates, published verification. The risk and controls of and greenwashing mitigations would include your combining ICMA alignment with SPOs, your second party opinions, external verification, machine readable reporting to provide an auditable trail that is going to reduce your classification of the risk across vendors and indices, because the document thresholds, exclusions, baselines, methods, boundaries, they're going to give the investors and the regulators a transparency decision logic which has been tied to recognized standards. So another thing is around the treasury and the legal aspects, from the framework to the enforceable terms that are going to be there. So if you look at the issuer brief that has been given by the UNDP, it talks about your new development partners, development of finance institution, the financial economy, the real economy, aligned with your SDG goals, because your framework of drafting and your ICMA alignment is going to be talking about the publishing of the framework, which is being aligned to ICMA outline eligible categories. So if you look at out here what the instruments are, how they have been schemes, with the governance for the project selection or the KPI management, ownership, proceeds, reporting of the verification of the commitments, disclosures of the capex versus refinancing of the instruments or the look back periods, in terms of the refinanced assets, and your different recognized classifications wherever relevant to enhance your comparability, and most importantly to reduce the greenwashing of the risks. The SOP around the procurement is very important, because this is you're coming in from your pre-issuance assurance, because here you're trying to look at the second party opinion, SPO rather, and assessing your alignment with your GBP, SBP, SG, SLBP, and checking the robustness of the eligibility criteria with the proceeds of KPIs, governance, reporting standards, reporting plans, publishing of the reports at any given time period, verifying with the SPOs. So the use of the SPO feedback to strengthen the thresholds and exclusions and bylines, baselines and methods before the launch, improving your investor confidence and index eligibility is what the SPO procurement or pre-issuance guidelines would be around this factor. Because the baseline and the trajectory that is going to come around for KPIs and for particularly for SLB sustainability linked bonds would basically look at two factors. One is defining the KPI itself, and two is around the documentation. So let's take one at a time. The first one, the defining of the KPI formulas, which would include your scopes, baselines, methodological notes, calibration of SPTs beyond business as usual, with interim waypoints and credible pathways which have been aligned with the support of ambition tests, and the document change management rules for methodology updates and M&A to preserve the target integrity across bond life and avoid disputes at observation dates is what the documentation is going to be all around. That's where the prospects and the offerings for the SLBs or UOPs components are going to be becoming very important, because you're using as a UOP, if you look at it, you have the hardwire exclusive use of proceeds, eligibility criteria, selection governance, ring fencing, management of proceeds, the temporary placement of unallocated funds, how those unallocated funds are going to be moved around. Post that, how you're going to, once the funds have been allocated, how frequently are you going to report? All that has to be taken into consideration when you're doing your UOP, while the SLB is going to be talking about the specification of the KPI definitions, SPT trajectories, observation calendars, trigger logic, step magnitudes, and other factors. Because reporting cadence and evidence pack is around commit at least annual reporting and maintain public evidence pack, which is we've talked about over and over again. Because the practical checklist of that for treasury and legal would include your ICMA aligned framework, which has been drafted around your SPO procured, that is your second party opinion, term sheet, prospectus, embedding into UOP terms, user proceeds terms, or SLB sustainability linked bond trigger mechanics, machine readable templates, preparedness, verification of cadence, scheduling, and evidence pack hosted publicly. These are some of the important factors that needs to be taken into account when you're looking at the treasury and the legal aspects as far as the framework for the enforceable, in terms of enforceable terms for any kind of a UOP or SLBs are concerned. This is coming again from the issue brief as by the United Nations Development Program, which is UNDP. Another point that we need to understand is the investor demand, the indices, the greenum or the green risk, as we are trying to understand, and how they're interlinked among themselves. So this diagram actually brings out beautifully that you have this SLBs which are contained. What the investor demand looks like is in terms of the principles of the alignment frameworks with eligible categories or the material KPIs, SPTs, plus the SPOs and the external verification, along with the lower diligence time, expansion in terms of the buyer base across ESG and credit score mandates, which is what is looking at. Machine readable allocations, your impact on KPI data sets using harmonized indicators, allowing your asset managers to automate your coverage, monitor the progress, scale mandates more confidently. Index inclusion as a demand amplifier talks about the index terms and the data vendors that are relying only on ICMA aligned disclosures and the harmonized templates for classification, so that the faster, cleaner ingestion increases, the likelihood and the speed of an index eligibility is there. Then there's going to be maintaining a public evidence pack, which is talking about the frameworks, the SPO, that is a second party opinion, offering of the extracts, the annual reports, verifiable statements, the reduction of the rework for index surveillance, support of the durable inclusion. The greening actually, or the green risk, why does this become very important and how do you define it is very, very interesting aspect, because any pricing benefit trending to emerge when credibility is higher, say with the clear ICMA alignment and the robust verification and the consistent reporting, and the demand from thematic and ESG mandates outstrips labeled supply. So the transparent capex versus refinancing of the splits, look back disclosures, reproducible impact metrics, they're going to strengthen the perceptions of integrity, improving your price tensions at the book build level itself. Because the structured maximized demand and indexability is very important for use of proceeds. You're going to specify the eligibility thresholds, exclusions, proceeds of the tracking, reporting of the cadence in the framework, term sheet. For SLBs or the sustainability linked bonds, you're talking about step ups economically meaningful with early observation and dates and verification covenants. Aligning the reports to ICMA template with units, baselines, factors, scopes, boundaries, so that the analyst can reproduce calculations without follow-ups. And the ongoing credibility and the second performance, with where your UOPs and the annual UOPs with the SPOs have been taken into consideration, becomes very important, because the performance and the reporting is going to be harmonized using the various indicators as far as the indexes, the data sources, the data cleanability, which is going to enhance your investor confidence and support the secondary liquidity factors in the market. That also brings us to another important point, and that is in terms of the demand driver. So where you're looking at the ESG integration with Paris or SDG mandates, and which have been very specifically dedicated to the green social fund. Now here, if you look at it from the India's perspective, that is synergy creation and SDGs and Paris Agreement, or the NDCs in India's perspective, you've got a structured expert view, which is constituting of academia, research, NGO, think tanks, CSO, firm, government, multilateral, bilateral agencies, UN entities, and all of them are responding from the 21 experts are coming. There's been an interview, data analysis around manual thematic analysis, which has produced the insights policy of the solution, best at practices, advises, and subnational and local governments, because you've got multiple themes and sub-themes that have been taken into consideration, which is producing your other tools and techniques around the priority-based preference for a minimum account, and like Kurt scale, which is another important scale that you're looking at. So the ESG integration and the baselining for the asset managers in increasingly requiring standardized sustainability data fields to integrate your ESG into research, risk, portfolio construction, favoring of the ICMA aligned instruments for comparability and surveillance. The harmonized templates and indicator guidance is going to be there to reduce your diligence friction, allowing the analyst to reproduce allocations, impact, or the KPI SPT results and scale the holdings systematically. The Paris SDG aligned mandates that the policy and the stewardship trends push the investors to align with the Paris Agreement pathways and the SDG outcomes, so as to elevate the demand for bonds and disclose credible baselines, methods, trajectory against recognized pathways. The ICMA's evolving guidance and the thematic materials are going to support the mapping to transition and the nature of the objectives to help the investors evidence mandate compliance with, while managing the greenwashing of the risk. Because the dedicated green and the social funds is around the thematic funds, insurers, pension mandates, then which are relying on clear use of proceeds categories or issuer level KPIs or SPTs with the external opinions and the verification to meet the funding requirements. So it is here that the sub-themes are becoming very important, and with the external verifiables or the external experts, as mentioned out here with the various areas. What is unlocking the demand and the depth of the potential greening is around clear ICMA alignment with your SLB step mechanics, synchronized verification, and to boost the credibility with the book quality and the quantity. Because the regional signals are there important to watch out. So take a case of Europe, where the sustainability preference and sustainability regimes, they continue to institutionalize ESG in distribution and product governance and reinforce standardized data expectations for issuers. While new guidelines or guidance and the illustrative KPIs, they are registering from the ICMA expanded sector coverage and sovereign applicability to support adoptions across utilities, industries, financials, and your public issuers as well. The pricing of the sustainable bond and the greening and the liquidity is very important, because if you look out here, how the entire flow is taking place for the your green bonds that are there, because you have the impact of the investors, and ultimately your SBI, SIB commissioners are there, and their service provider is there along with the evaluator, and this is a complete circular flow that moves around. Interestingly, if you look at it, evidence and debate on the greenum has become very, very, very hardcore and very popular and one of the most talked about topics in this area, because the greenum is tightening versus vanilla comparisons is more likely when credibility is high, and clear ICMA guidelines and alignment with robust SPO verification and reproducible data sets reduce the perceived greenwashing of the risks and widening of the buyer base. The greenum is episodic and instrument issuer cycle dependent, supply demand dependent imbalances and thematic mandates, and rapid indexability, which is there to create transient spread advantages. Because the liquidity considerations, when you look at it, it comes from the liquidity benefits from standardized disclosures that enable inclusion in major sustainable indices and wider distribution to ESG mandated investors, improving a secondary depth. Machine readable harmonized reports keep the vendor data sets current, helping the market makers and the investors monitor positions and reduce your uncertainty discounts. Because index inclusion at a pricing analyst, you're looking at it in terms of eligibility, which is hinging on your ICMA aligned frameworks, SPOs, structured allocation with respect to the impact in terms of UOP or KPI, SPT in terms of SLB data sets. Quicker index classification can broaden the demand and compress the spreads. Synchronizing verification with reporting accelerates your index flag updates and supports a sustained inclusion, stabilizing your secondary variations. When you look at it, performance versus vanilla bonds, when the disclosures are comparable and verified, the sustainable bonds can price in line with one inside or in line with the vanilla curve. That is where the investors value accountability. Because when you look at this report around this is coming from Allied Market Research, look at the way that the report insights are producing the market valued at $976 billion to $2047.6 billion in the projected to research. So they're talking all the way from 2013, 2023 to all the way down to 2033. So the expected increase with the CAGR of 7.5% happening over a given time period, because data investors, they're pricing in your UOP and the SLBs with respect to your category thresholds, capex financing, KPI definitions, step size materiality, and all the other factors that we have been talking over and over again. That brings me to another interesting point, and this is around the policy context in terms of the disclosures of the taxonomies and the border coverage, cross-border convergence, because the growth of the taxonomies has led to a huge challenge, because multiple jurisdictions are there which are introducing activity-based taxonomies that are classifying your eligible green social activities so as to reduce your greenwashing and guide your capital allocations with ICMA categories to provide practical bridge for the issuers. Convergence pressure is rising as investors are demanding crosswalks from ICMA categories to regional taxonomies to enable portfolio comparability and index screening across the borders. And therefore, one needs to have a very, very clear approach towards what exactly is the taxonomy as defined. So when you look at sustainable finance, it can come in the environmental, social, economic, and other SDG goals. Again, in the environmental, you've got climate change mitigation to climate change adoption to other environmental factors. So you've got a low carbon to climate to green, based on the environmental factors. So these are all defined, the financial flows that are there. Because here the disclosure rules and the data standards are very important, because new and evolving disclosure regimes require decision useful, reproducible data fields. Therefore, the ICMA's harmonized templates, which is specifying the units, baseline factors, scopes, and boundaries to meet these expectations, are very, very important factors, because any kind of a public evidence pack in terms of the framework, SPO, or the offering of the extracts, your verification of the statements, acceleration in terms of the vendor ingestion, index exclusion, and the other diverse data sets are the ones that needs to be taken care of when you're looking at a cross-border convergence, because the implications for the cross-border issuance comes for two reasons. One is issuers benefit from preparing ICMA aligned data sets and adding taxonomy crosswalks. which have been tailored to target markets, reducing your rework, time to index cross regions, synchronizing the reporting and the verification cadence with policy calendars, improving your inclusion speed and reducing your valuation overhang from the data gaps, So therefore, all these factors become very important, particularly from the perspective of a policy and the disclosures and with respect to your cross-border data convergence. Finally, an important point, and which is the use of technology, because the data and the digital world, they're all combining together for the ESG and SDG goals. So in order to have a better ESG data, you need to look at a harmonized ICMA templates. We talked about it with the publish and evidence-based pack. However, when you look at interoperable taxonomies, you're going to map your ICMA categories or SLB KPI families to your regional taxonomies and the digital standards such as GRI, XBRL, ISSB, ESRS, and documenting your thresholds, exclusions, methods to support the cross-border portability. Machine-readable impact reports is around providing allocation, impact, UOP, and KPI SPTs with data sets in machine-readable formats, which have been again aligned to your ICMA templates. The climate bonds will review the highlight progress, but will urge further fuller disclosures of methods, project-level data, so as to enhance the comparability and the lifetime impact assessments. Why does this actually matter? Because the machine-readable assured data is going to reduce the information risk and the speed of the vendors in terms of data ingestion, the processing of the information at the real time, the use of artificial intelligence, the use of GIS technologies, which is there for the interoperability of taxonomies, the digital filings, cutting across the border rework, and enabling the issuers to reach the goal or the global mandate with respect to a single data backbone. So therefore, the entire use of technology is going to be very important. That brings us to the end of this lecture series. Thank you. My name is Atul Tripathi, and I am honorary adjunct fellow at National Maritime Foundation. Thank you.